Hey guys, welcome back to Meghan Grace DIY. Today is another addition to my Back to Basics series where we cover individual sewing techniques so you can build up a strong library of sewing skills. Today we're going to cover how to do a corded or piped seam. This is an accent that can bring a lot of sophistication to any design you make. You may have noticed piping or cording in the interior design setting, like on pillows, but we can use piping or cording in any type of design that we want to make. For this demonstration, I'll be using 2 rectangles of cotton fabric as if they were the seam of your project. I will also be using store-bought, pre-made bias cut piping. You can make your own piping, but we're going to cover that in another video. One important note about piping is that it should have the same amount of stretch as your project. So if you have a stretchy project, you should have stretchy piping. I've cut a piece of the pre-made piping a little bit longer than my sample cotton rectangle, and we're going to lay it down onto one side of the sample with the piping facing the right-hand side and the raw tape aligned with the raw edge of the cotton sample. I'm placing a few pins to hold the piping in place before I go over to the sewing machine, but it's very important to note that these are the type of pins you need to take out before you sew over them. If not, you could end up with little warbles in your seam, and we don't want that. Once you're all pinned in place, we're going to go over to the sewing machine and sew about halfway between the rough edge and the piping. This is going to be our stay stitch to hold our piping in place for when we actually sew our seam. In order to properly sew piping, you will need to swap out your regular standard presser foot for a zipper presser foot, or else you won't be able to get close enough to the piping for it to look nice in your garment. Once again on this step, we're sewing halfway between the raw edge and the piped edge, so that way our piping is held in place when we go to actually sew the seam. Just a reminder that I use contrasting thread so you guys can see my samples better, but you should use a thread that matches your binding for this project. One of the really cool things about the Singer sewing machine is that the zipper foot drops down and allows you to switch sides depending on which side you need to be closer to your seam. Now that we've got our piping stay stitched in place, we're going to put the other side of the fabric, wrong sides touching each other, on top of that piping and pin the whole thing together. Our goal is to sew as close to that piping as possible. It's going to feel like you're sewing into the piping a little bit, but that's okay, because if you feel like you're not, chances are you're too far away from the piping and you're going to see some of that tape through your seam. There are specific presser feet out there for sewing this small type of piping, so if you feel like you're doing a lot of this, it might be wise to invest in that type of presser foot. If you do this not very often, then a zipper foot is fine. For the final sewing step on our piping, I'm going to swap back to our regular presser foot, and we're going to apply a zigzag stitch down the rough edge of the seam. That way we have a seam finish in place. If you have a serger, feel free to serge this edge as well. And here's a close-up look of what the inside of your corded piping seam should look like. With all of the stitch work done, let's get a look at what our cording looks like from the outside of our project. See, we don't want to see any of the tape showing, we want to see just that piping right along the seam. But wait, we're not done just yet. Get ready to break out your iron because we're going to put a final press on this baby. Since the seam allowance for this type of seam is going to be a bit on the bulky side, I press the seam allowance to one side and press from the top and make sure it's nice and flat, and then I flip my seam allowance to the other side and do the same thing. And with that, you've learned how to add piping to any seam on any project. Thanks for stopping by Meghan Grace DIY. I hope you found these videos helpful, and if you did, feel free to hit the subscribe and the notify button. And if there are any specific Back to Basic tutorials that you're looking for, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Happy sewing, everybody!